The water came for everything, every city, every temple, every whispered secret carved into stone. The skies split open and did not close for 40 days and 40 nights. And when the last wave finally settled into silence, the world that had existed before was gone, swallowed, erased, rewritten. Or so we were told, because somewhere beneath the layers of sacred text, beneath centuries of careful translation and deliberate omission, a question has been waiting in the dark like a body buried too shallow. If God wiped the earth clean of Cain's cursed lineage, if the flood was total and absolute and final, then why do the fingerprints of that forbidden bloodline appear again on the other side of the waters? In the cities, in the bloodlines, in the knowledge that no survivor of a catastrophe should have possessed? There are manuscripts that have not been read aloud in public in over 1,000 years. There are archive rooms in institutions older than most nations where texts sit behind locked doors, not because they are fragile, but because what they contain has never been meant for ordinary eyes. Ancient scribes from Mesopotamia, from Egypt, from the highlands of Ethiopia, all wrote about the same thing. A lineage that was supposed to end and did not. A knowledge that was supposed to drown and surfaced again. Builders who arrived after the flood already knowing how to build. The story of Cain did not end in Genesis 4. It did not end with the flood. And the evidence, hidden across the oldest texts humanity has ever produced, suggests that what was buried was not destroyed. It was preserved. And it is still here. There is a genealogy in Genesis that most people read once and never think about again. It sits in Genesis 4, squeezed between the story of the first murder and the account of Noah, and it reads like a list of names that do not matter. Enoch, Irad, Mehushael, Methushael, Lamech. Most readers glance at these names, assume they are ancient, and move on. But stop for a moment. Look at that list again with fresh eyes. Because what you are reading is not filler. What you are reading is the curriculum of a civilization that was never supposed to be remembered. These are the sons of Cain, and their story does not end where the Bible stops telling it. God cursed Cain. In Genesis 4 verse 11, the ground would no longer yield strength to him. He would be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. That was the sentence. That was the verdict spoken directly by God over the first murderer in human history. And yet, within just a few verses, something extraordinary happens that almost no one stops to question. Cain builds a city, not a camp, not a shelter carved into a hillside, a city. Genesis 4, verse 17 states it plainly, "And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch." When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. A wanderer who builds a city, a fugitive who founds a civilization. Does that not strike you as strange? Because it should. The Hebrew word used in that verse is the word Ir, which refers to a walled settlement, a place of organized habitation with defined boundaries and structure. This was not improvisation. This was intention. Cain, under divine curse, under divine sentence, built something permanent, and the line that descended from that city produced some of the most remarkable figures in all of pre-flood history. His descendants invented tent dwelling and the raising of livestock. They invented musical instruments, and perhaps most disturbingly, they mastered the forging of bronze and iron. Not in the Bronze Age, as historians date it. Not in the Iron Age, as archaeologists define it. Before the flood, that is what Genesis 4, verses 20 through 22 tells you, and almost no one preaches about it from the pulpit. Guarda esa pregunta, porque la respuesta está en lo que viene después. Why would a cursed bloodline, a lineage that God seemingly condemned from its origin, produce the technological foundations of human civilization? Why would the descendants of the first murderer be the ones who taught humanity to forge metal, to make music, to build. There is a pattern here that the text is almost daring you to see. And when you begin to see it, you start to realize that the story of Cain is not a simple cautionary tale about sin and punishment. It is something far more complex and far more unsettling. It is the story of a parallel humanity developing alongside the line of Seth, the line that would eventually produce Noah, and that parallel humanity was not idle. Now think about this carefully. The Book of Jubilees, an ancient Jewish text that predates the time of Jesus and was considered scripture by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church for centuries, provides details about Cain's lineage that the canonical Bible carefully omits. The Book of Jubilees describes Cain's descendants as builders and as keepers of knowledge that had been passed down in ways that set them apart from the rest of humanity. These were not simple farmers struggling in the dust. These were a people with accumulated wisdom, with inherited craft, with something that looked remarkably like institutional knowledge passed from generation to generation with deliberate precision. The term used in ancient Hebrew for this kind of transmission is taladat, and it means far more than just a genealogical list. It means a structured account of origins and developments, a record of what was built and who built it. And here is where the silence in the text becomes deafening. After the flood, Genesis simply does not return to what happened to Cain's line. There is no verse that says, "And the sons of Cain were destroyed." There is no roll call of the condemned. The flood narrative in Genesis 6 through 8 describes a world corrupted beyond recovery and God's decision to wipe it clean. But the specific fate of Cain's descendants is never explicitly stated with the kind of finality you would expect. Why does the Bible not close that door clearly? Why does it not say specifically and unambiguously that this lineage ended in the waters? Because the absence of a denial is itself a kind of admission. And the ancient texts that orbit the edges of Scripture suggest that the silence is not accidental. The Book of Enoch, which was quoted directly in the New Testament letter of Jude, describes the antediluvian world as one in which forbidden knowledge had been distributed widely among humanity through agents who had crossed boundaries they were never meant to cross. That knowledge did not evaporate when the rain began. Knowledge does not drown. Techniques do not sink to the bottom of the ocean. And the civilizations that emerged almost immediately after the flood, with architecture and metallurgy and astronomical systems that seem too advanced for their supposed primitive state, raise a question that archaeology has never satisfactorily answered. Where did they learn it? Where did that knowledge come from if the flood truly resets everything to zero?
Detente.
Un segundo. Consider what the post-flood world looks like in the biblical narrative. Noah and his 3 sons emerge from the ark. They are, by all accounts, farmers. Noah plants a vineyard. His sons spread across the earth. And yet, within just a few generations, we have Nimrod building the city of Babel. We have the rise of Egypt. We have Mesopotamian city-states with writing systems and legal codes and astronomical observatories. The jump from a family of farmers to a network of advanced civilizations is not explained by the text. It is simply presented as fact, as if the knowledge required to build those civilizations was already present, already available, already in someone's hands before the first brick was laid. And if you are honest with yourself, there is only one explanation that makes the timeline make sense. The name of Cain was never supposed to survive the waters. The civilization he founded was never supposed to be remembered. But memory is stubborn, and knowledge is resilient, and the ancient texts that were collected and then quietly set aside by the councils that shaped the Bible we hold today tell a story that is far from finished. Cain's sons did not disappear. They left fingerprints on the world that we are still finding, still measuring, still standing in front of with our mouths open, because we cannot explain what we are looking at. And as this story unfolds, layer by layer, text by text, you will begin to see that the silence in Genesis is not the silence of something that ended. It is the silence of something that was hidden. There is a difference. And understanding that difference changes everything. Imagine the scene with care, not mud huts, not scattered fires burning in the open darkness of a primitive world. Imagine instead a city rising from the plains of the ancient Near East, its walls cut from stone with a precision that speaks of practiced hands and inherited technique. Imagine the sound of hammers striking metal, the low hum of stringed instruments echoing through streets where people gather not just to survive, but to trade, to organize, to plan. This is the world of Cain's descendants, as the Bible itself describes as it, and it is nothing like what most people picture when they think of the era before Noah. The antediluvian world was not a world of ignorance. It was a world of accumulated, deliberate, and terrifying sophistication. Genesis 4 gives us three names that deserve far more attention than they receive: Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal-Cain. These are the sons of Lamech, the seventh generation in the line of Cain, and between them, they account for some of the most foundational developments in human civilization. Jabal is credited as the father of those who dwell in tents and raise livestock, which means organized animal husbandry, the management of herds, the foundation of pastoral economies. Jubal is called the father of all who play the harp and flute, which means not just music for pleasure, but the entire cultural infrastructure that music represents: ceremony, worship, social cohesion, the organization of human emotion into shared experience. And then there is Tubal-Cain. Genesis 4, verse 22 calls him an instructor of every cutting instrument in bronze and iron. Read that again. Bronze and iron. Before the flood. Now, here is what makes that detail so deeply unsettling when you hold it against the rest of human history. Historians and archaeologists have spent generations constructing a timeline in which the Bronze Age began approximately 5,000 years ago, and the Iron Age followed several centuries later. These transitions are treated as monumental leaps in human capability, developments that reshaped warfare, agriculture, architecture, and trade across entire continents. And yet, Genesis 4 places the mastery of both metals in the hands of a single man, in a single generation, in a world that predates the flood by an unspecified but enormous span of time. That is not a minor detail. That is a civilizational anomaly hiding inside a genealogy that most readers skip over entirely. The question is not whether it is true. The question is what it means if it is. The Book of Jubilees fills in details that Genesis leaves deliberately vague. In its account of the antediluvian world, the descendants of Cain are not presented as scattered wanderers gradually stumbling toward civilization. They are presented as a structured society with defined roles, accumulated knowledge, and a relationship with the material world that set them apart from the sons of Seth. The Book of Jubilees describes how Cain's line built cities that grew into networks, how knowledge was passed from parent to child, with the kind of intentionality that implies a culture that valued preservation above almost everything else. This was not accidental progress. This was engineered inheritance. And it raises a question that the text never directly answers, but constantly implies. Who taught them to begin? The ancient Sumerian king list, one of the oldest written documents in human existence, describes a series of kings who ruled before a great flood, each of them reigning for thousands of years, each of them associated with specific forms of knowledge and craft that they introduced to humanity. The parallels with the Cainite genealogy are not subtle. Long lifespans, specialized knowledge attributed to specific individuals, a civilization that rose to extraordinary heights before being interrupted by a catastrophic deluge. Scholars have debated for generations whether the Sumerian flood narrative and the biblical flood are describing the same event, but almost no one asks the more dangerous question, whether the Sumerian kings and the sons of Cain are describing the same people. More than 200 ancient cultures across every inhabited continent carry flood narratives. Many of them also carry stories of a civilization before the flood that possessed knowledge far beyond what survival alone would require. Detente un segundo. Think about what it means for a pre-flood civilization to have mastered iron. Iron smelting requires temperatures above 1,500 degrees Celsius. It requires understanding of ore selection, of fuel management, of bellows and furnace design. It requires, in other words, a body of technical knowledge that does not appear spontaneously. It is developed over generations of trial, observation, and recorded failure. For Tubal Cain to be called an instructor of iron working implies not just personal skill, but a school, a tradition, a lineage of knowledge that he was passing forward. And if that lineage of knowledge was being passed forward before the flood, then the flood did not destroy it by destroying one man. It would have had to destroy every student, every apprentice, every person who had ever watched the process and remembered it. The flood would have had to be a perfect and total erasure. And the evidence scattered across the oldest ruins on Earth suggests it was not. Göbekli Tepe in what is now southern Turkey was buried deliberately. Not by time, not by erosion, not by the slow accumulation of centuries of wind-blown dust. It was intentionally backfilled by human hands approximately 10,000 years ago, which places its construction even further back than that. The site contains carved pillars with animal reliefs of extraordinary artistic sophistication, arranged in circles that suggest astronomical alignment, ritual purpose, and a degree of communal organization that requires, at minimum, a surplus economy capable of feeding non-agricultural laborers for extended periods. It is, by any reasonable definition, a monument built by people who already knew what they were doing. Nobody built Göbekli Tepe as their first attempt at architecture. This was the product of a tradition. And the tradition that produced it has no known origin in the archaeological record. It simply appears fully formed, as if it arrived from somewhere else. And this is where everything begins to escalate, because Göbekli Tepe is not alone. The megalithic structures of Malta predate the Egyptian pyramids by 1,000 years and display engineering solutions that engineers today describe as elegant. The ancient city of Jericho one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements ever discovered, shows signs of organized construction dating back to approximately 11,000 years before the present, which places its earliest layers squarely in the time frame that many scholars associate with the post-flood world. The knowledge required to build these places did not come from nowhere. It came from somewhere, from someone, a tradition of craft, and understanding that survived something it was not supposed to survive. Cain's civilization was not supposed to be remembered, but stone remembers, metal remembers, and the ruins that dot the ancient world like punctuation marks in a sentence we have not yet learned to read are telling us something that the text of Genesis 4 was trying very carefully to say and very carefully to not say at the same time. The civilization was real, and it did not simply vanish. There is a book that was quoted in the New Testament, studied by the earliest church fathers, and then quietly removed from the biblical canon during the councils of the 4th century. Its name is the Book of Enoch, and for 1500 years it was lost to the Western world, surviving only in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, which never stopped treating it as sacred scripture. Then, in the 18th century, the Scottish explorer James Bruce brought 3 copies of it back from Ethiopia, and scholars who read it for the first time in centuries were left with a problem they have never satisfactorily resolved. The Book of Enoch does not contradict Genesis. It expands it, and what it expands is precisely the part of the story that the canonical Bible leaves most deliberately obscure. The relationship between fallen celestial beings and the bloodline of Cain. Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. These are perhaps the most contested verses in all of Scripture. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Hebrew phrase translated as sons of God is bin ha Elohim, a term that appears elsewhere in the Old Testament exclusively in reference to angelic or celestial beings, never to human men. The Nephilim appear described as the offspring of these unions as mighty men of old and of renown. And then, almost immediately, the narrative pivots to God's decision to send the flood. The connection is not subtle, but the canonical Bible gives you almost none of the detail. The Book of Enoch gives you everything. According to the Book of Enoch, a group of 200 celestial beings called the Watchers descended to a mountain called Ardis on the summit of Mount Hermon and made a collective oath to carry out a plan they knew was forbidden. Their leader is named Semyaza, and the text is explicit that he understood the transgression he was proposing. The Watchers took human wives, and from those unions came the Nephilim, described in the Book of Enoch as giants of enormous stature whose appetites eventually turned destructive against the very humanity they had been born into. But the physical transgression was not the only one. The Watchers also brought knowledge, specific, enumerated, categorized knowledge that human beings were not supposed to possess at that stage of history. And the list of what they taught reads like a curriculum for the antediluvian civilization that Genesis 4 describes in the line of Cain. Azazel, one of the named Watchers, taught men the making of swords and shields and breastplates, and showed women the art of beautification and adornment. Another Watcher named Amazarach taught all the sorcerers and the cutting of roots. Armaros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the knowledge of the clouds and the signs of the stars. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. And Sariel taught the course of the moon. Now hold that list next to what Genesis 4 tells us about the sons of Cain. Metallurgy, music, agriculture, foundations of organized civilization. The parallel is not perfect, but it is close enough to demand an explanation. Someone taught these things. The Book of Enoch tells you who. But here is what almost no one stops to ask. Why would the Watchers have chosen to concentrate their activity in a world where Cain's civilization was already the dominant human power structure? The line of Seth, which would eventually produce Noah, is described throughout the antediluvian narrative as a people who called on the name of God, who maintained a different kind of relationship with the divine. Cain's line, by contrast, had been moving in a consistently different directions since the moment Cain left the presence of God in Genesis 4, verse 16. A bloodline already oriented away from divine authority, already in possession of advanced technical knowledge, already building cities and accumulating power. That is not a bloodline that resists a forbidden alliance. That is a bloodline that invites one. And the Book of Enoch, read carefully, suggests that the relationship between the Watchers and the pre-flood world was not random. It was targeted. The Book of Jubilees adds another layer that makes this connection even more explicit. It describes the antediluvian world in terms of a progressive corruption that spread not just through physical interbreeding, but through the transmission of forbidden knowledge across generations, embedded into the cultural and intellectual inheritance of entire family lines. The Hebrew concept at work here is significant. The word yada, often translated simply as to know, carries in its deeper usage the meaning of intimate, transformative, covenant-level knowledge, the kind of knowing that changes what you are, not just what you can do. When the Watchers taught humanity, they were not handing out information. They were initiating a transformation. And according to both the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, that transformation ran deepest in the lines that were already most receptive to it. Now think about why this book was removed from the canon. The early church father Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd century, considered the Book of Enoch authentic and authoritative. The letter of Jude, which is in the New Testament, quotes it directly in verses 14 and 15, attributing the words to Enoch himself as a prophetic utterance. The early Ethiopian church never questioned its status, and yet by the time the councils of Laodicea and later Carthage were defining the boundaries of the biblical canon. In the 4th century, the Book of Enoch was excluded. The official reasoning was concerns about its authenticity and its late composition. But scholars who have analyzed the oldest Aramaic fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls have confirmed that portions of the Book of Enoch predate the Christian era by at least 2 centuries. The authenticity argument does not hold, which means the exclusion requires a different explanation. What the Book of Enoch provides that the canonical Bible withholds is a named, detailed, sequenced account of exactly how the pre-flood world became what it became, and exactly which lines of human descent were most deeply shaped by the Watchers' intervention. It names the teachers. It names the subjects they taught. and it names the consequences with a directness that makes the flood not just an act of divine grief, as Genesis presents it, but an act of surgical necessity against a specific and identifiable contamination. If Cain's bloodline was the primary host of that contamination, then the flood was aimed, at least in part, at them. And if the flood failed to complete that aim, if something of that lineage and that knowledge survived, then the question is not theological. It is historical. It is archaeological. It is, in the most unsettling sense possible, personal. Because the world those survivors built is the world we inherited, and the knowledge they carried did not disappear. It was simply waiting for the right moment to surface again. Most people who read Genesis 4 stop paying attention by the time they reach Lamech. He appears. Late in the chapter, he has an unusual domestic arrangement with 2 wives, and he delivers a short speech that most translations render in a way that makes it sound like simple boasting. Then the text moves on, and so do the readers. But stop here, because Lamech's speech, known among biblical scholars as the Song of the Sword, is one of the most compressed and enigmatic utterances in all of the Old Testament. It is only 4 lines long, and inside those 4 lines is a confession, a threat, and a theological claim that, when read in the original Hebrew, fundamentally changes what it means to be a descendant of Cain. This is not a footnote, this is a key. Genesis 4, verses 23 and 24. Lamech speaks to his 2 wives, Adah and Zillah. Hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, truly Lamech 77-fold. That is the speech. Read it again slowly, because what Lamech is doing here is not simply describing an act of violence. He is invoking the divine protection that God placed over Cain after the murder of Abel, and claiming that his own protection is 11 times greater. He is inserting himself into the covenant logic that God established with his ancestor and escalating it by an order of magnitude. That is not the behavior of a man who feels cursed. That is the behavior of a man who believes his bloodline is protected, favored, and operating under a different set of rules than everyone else. The Hebrew word Lamech uses for the man he killed is Ish, which simply means a man, an adult male. But the word he uses for the young man is Yild, which can mean a boy, a child, or a young person's still in development. Some ancient commentators read this not as Lamech describing 2 separate acts of violence, but as a poetic parallelism describing a single act, the killing of someone who had injured him, expressed in 2 different registers. But other ancient readings, preserved in Jewish midrashic tradition, take the passage in a far more disturbing direction. In one prominent midrash, Lamech was partially blind and was guided on a hunt by his young son, Tubal-Cain. The son mistook a figure in the brush for an animal, and Lamech, following his son's direction, released an arrow that killed Cain himself. When Lamech realized what he had done, he struck his son in grief and rage, and the speech to his wives is his response to the double death he had caused. Now, here is why that reading matters, whether or not it is literally true. It places Lamech at the center of a closed circle of Cainite violence, in which the bloodline that began with murder ends a generational cycle with another murder, this time consuming its own founder. That is the kind of narrative structure that ancient writers used deliberately as a theological statement about a lineage. But what is theologically remarkable is what Lamech claims in the aftermath. He does not repent. He does not seek God as his ancestor's brother Abel had been sought by God. He appeals instead to a principle of escalating retribution that he frames as his birthright, 77-fold. The protection on his line is not diminished by the violence within it. It is, in his own reckoning, amplified. That is a worldview, that is a theology, and it is a theology that has nothing to do with the God of Seth's line. The number 77 is not arbitrary in the ancient Hebrew world. Numbers in the biblical text carry weight that modern Western readers consistently underestimate. 7 is the number of completion, of covenant, of divine action in the world. When God placed a mark on Cain and declared that anyone who killed him would suffer vengeance sevenfold, that was a divine numerical guarantee. When Lamech claims 77-fold, he is not just multiplying. He is claiming a covenantal amplification, a protection so extreme that it places his line effectively beyond the reach of ordinary divine judgment. And this is deeply significant when you hold it next to what Jesus says in Matthew 18, verse 22, when Peter asks how many times he should forgive, and Jesus answers, not 7 times, but 77 times. Most scholars read that as a reference directly back to Lamech's speech, as a deliberate inversion, replacing the logic of escalating vengeance with the logic of escalating forgiveness. The two speeches are mirror images of two opposing civilizational principles, and the one that Lamech represents did not die with him. The sons of Lamech are Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal-Cain, the 3 figures we examined earlier as the founders of pastoral economy, music, and metallurgy. These men were raised by a father who understood his bloodline as operating under a protection that God had never revoked. A father who had personally tested the limits of violence and found no divine consequence sufficient to stop him. What kind of civilization does that produce? What kind of cultural inheritance flows from a man who looks at the logic of divine judgment and responds by doubling down? It produces exactly the civilization that Genesis 6 describes in the verses immediately preceding the flood account, a world in which the wickedness of humanity was great, in which every intention of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil continually, not occasionally evil, not partially corrupt, only continually. That is the end state of a civilization founded on Lamech's theology. And here is the detail that most translations obscure. The Hebrew word used in Genesis 6, verse 5, for the intentions of the human heart is yetzer, which refers not to random impulses, but to the formed and deliberate inclination of a person's inner life, the deep orientation of the will. When the text says that the yetzer of humanity was only evil continually, it is saying that the antediluvian world had reached a state of total interior corruption, that the very faculty of intentional thought had been reoriented away from God so completely that there was no longer any mixed motive, no residual pull toward good. That is not a description of a society making bad choices. That is a description of a civilization that had been restructured from the inside, whose very mental and spiritual architecture had been rebuilt around a different foundation. Lamech's speech is the moment you can see that restructuring happening in real time, in one man, in 4 lines, in a claim of 77-fold protection that turns divine mercy into a tool of human arrogance. He was not the end of that process. He was the middle of it. And the question that his speech leaves open, the question that Genesis never directly answers, is whether the process he represented truly ended when the waters rose, or whether someone carried that interior architecture forward, past the flood, into the world we live in now. The dimensions of the ark are given with unusual precision for a text that rarely bothers with architectural specifics. Genesis 6, verse 15, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Scholars and engineers have calculated that this structure, built to the proportions described, would have had a cargo capacity equivalent to approximately 520 modern railroad freight cars. That is an enormous vessel, large enough for animals, for food, for 8 human beings, and for everything God intended to preserve through the judgment. But here is the question that the text never asks and never answers, the question that sits at the very center of this entire investigation. What cannot fit inside a wooden vessel, no matter how large? Knowledge, memory, the deep cultural inheritance of a civilization that had been building, teaching, and transmitting for generations. The flood drowned bodies. It could not drown what those bodies carried inside them. The Book of Jubilees, in its account of the period immediately surrounding the flood, makes a statement that the canonical Genesis does not. It describes how, in the generations before the waters came, certain knowledge was inscribed on stone tablets and on surfaces designed to survive catastrophe, precisely because those who created them understood that a judgment was approaching. The tradition of pre-flood inscription appears not only in the Book of Jubilees, but in the writings of the 1st century Jewish historian Josephus, who describes in his Antiquities of the Jews a tradition that the descendants of Seth inscribed their astronomical and scientific knowledge on 2 pillars, one of brick and one of stone, so that if one was destroyed by fire or flood, the other might survive. Josephus says that the stone pillar was still standing in his own time in the land of Syria. That is a 1st century eyewitness claim about a pre-flood monument, and almost no one talks about it. But the inscription of knowledge on stone is only one mechanism of survival. The more powerful mechanisms is human memory, specifically the memory carried by women. And here is where the narrative of the flood develops a crack that grows wider the more carefully you examine it. Genesis tells us that Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives entered the ark. 8 people. The sons are named Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The wives are never named anywhere in the canonical text. They are simply present, unnamed, unexamined, treated as biological necessities for the repopulation of the earth, rather than as individuals with histories, lineages, and cultural inheritances of their own. That omission is not neutral. In a text as carefully constructed as Genesis, the absence of names is always a choice. And the choice to leave these women nameless means that the choice to leave their origins unexamined was also intentional. The ancient Sumerian flood narrative, preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in earlier Sumerian texts, describes the flood survivor known as Utnapishtim as a man who was instructed by the god Enki to preserve not only living creatures, but the seeds of all living things and the craft knowledge of civilization. The parallel with Noah is close enough that scholars have debated for over a century whether they describe the same event. But what the Sumerian account adds that Genesis omits is an explicit emphasis on the preservation of knowledge as a deliberate act, not a byproduct of survival, but a primary objective. Someone decided what to save. Someone made choices about what the post-flood world would remember and what it would be allowed to rebuild. And if those choices were made by human beings as well as by God, then the people making them brought their own judgments, their own loyalties, and their own inheritances to the task. Now here is where everything begins to escalate. The Book of Enoch describes a conversation between the angel Uriel and Enoch, in which the judgment of the flood is explained not as a total erasure, but as a purging with a specific target. The watchers are bound and imprisoned. The Nephilim, their offspring, are condemned to become disembodied spirits that wander the earth. But the knowledge the watchers transmitted, the techniques, the formulas, the astronomical systems, the metallurgical processes, is not described as destroyed. It is described as corrupted, as having spread too widely to be recalled. You cannot unteach what has been taught. You cannot unknow what has been known. And if even one person who carried that knowledge in living memory stepped off the ark onto dry ground, then the flood's purpose as a clean reset was, at minimum, incomplete. The ancient Mandaean texts, preserved by a Gnostic religious community in what is now southern Iraq and Iran, contain cosmological traditions that predate Islam and show deep roots in the same ancient Near Eastern world that produced Genesis. The Mandaeans have their own flood narrative, and in their version, the survivors of the flood include figures who carry specifically forbidden knowledge forward into the new world, not as an accident of survival, but as a deliberate act of preservation against divine intent. The Mandaean tradition is explicit about something that the biblical text only implies: that the post-flood world was not a blank. It was a palimpsest, a surface that had been written over, but not fully erased, in which the shapes of the older writing still showed through if you held it to the right light. More than 200 flood traditions across cultures separated by entire oceans carry variations of this same motif. The flood came. Something survived that should not have, and the world that followed was shaped by what that something built. Detente un segundo. Think about the timeline that Genesis itself provides after the flood. Noah's family exits the ark in Genesis 8. By Genesis 10, we already have the Table of Nations, a detailed genealogical account of how the post-flood world was divided among the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. By Genesis 11, we have the Tower of Babel, a construction project of sufficient ambition that God himself says, in verse 6, that nothing the people propose to do will be impossible for them. Read that again. Nothing will be impossible for them. That is not the language of a primitive society fumbling towards civilization. That is the language of a people who already possess extraordinary capability, who have already demonstrated what they can accomplish, and whose ambition is scaling faster than the post-flood timeline can reasonably explain. Unless the timeline is not the whole story. Unless what they could do was not invented after the flood. Unless it was remembered from before. The ark preserved 8 people and the biological foundation of the post-flood world. But the ark was not the only vessel of preservation. Memory is a vessel. Culture is a vessel. The oral traditions that ancient peoples treated as sacred trusts passed from elder to child with the same seriousness that a metallurgist passes a technique to an apprentice are vessels. And the women who carried those traditions the unnamed wives of Noah's sons, women whose origins the text refuses to specify, are vessels. What the ark could not contain was already contained elsewhere, in minds, in hands, in the habits of thought and craft that do not require stone or wood or pitch to survive. The flood was real, the judgment was real, but a judgment that leaves the carrier of a disease alive, even unintentionally, even through the mercy required to save 8 human lives, does not fully cure what it was sent to heal. And the symptoms of that unfinished cure are written into every anomalous ruin, every impossibly advanced ancient structure, every civilization that appears in the archaeological record already, knowing things it should not yet know. 8 people survived the flood. That is the number Genesis gives us, and it is a number so small against the scale of global catastrophe that it tends to dominate every conversation about the narrative. Noah, his wife, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. 8 souls sealed inside a wooden vessel, while the world that had existed for centuries dissolved into water and silence. But here is the question that almost no one thinks to ask. We know 4 of those 8 people with reasonable clarity. Noah is described in detail across multiple chapters. His sons are named, their descendants cataloged, their post-flood territories mapped in Genesis 10 with careful geographic precision. And the 4 women? They have no names in the canonical Bible, not one. They enter the ark as extensions of their husbands and exit it the same way. And the text moves forward as if their identities, their origins, their family histories are entirely irrelevant to what comes next. In a book that names the daughters of Zelophehad, that names the midwives who defied Pharaoh, that names the foreign women who shaped the lineage of David, the silence about the wives of Noah's sons is not an oversight, it is a choice. The ancient text known as the Book of Noah, fragments of which are preserved within the larger corpus of the Book of Enoch, and which scholars believe circulated independently in the centuries before the Common Era, contains a passage that the canonical tradition buried so effectively that most Christians and Jews have never encountered it. In this passage, the birth of Noah himself is described in terms that cause his father Lamech. Yes, that Lamech, the one from Genesis 5 in the line of Seth, not Cain's Lamech, to panic. The child is born with white hair, with a body that radiates light, with eyes that illuminate the room like the sun. Lamech goes to his own father, Methuselah, in fear, and says that the child does not resemble him, that he looks instead like the sons of the God of heaven, like the Nephilim. The implication is shattering. Even within Noah's own family, in the line of Seth, the contamination that the vultures had introduced was close enough to the surface that a newborn with unusual features could trigger genuine terror about his parentage. If the line of Seth was not immune to this anxiety, what does that tell us about the women who married into it? The apocryphal text known as the Genesis Apocryphon, discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls and dated to the last centuries before the Common Era, expands the Noah birth narrative further and names Noah's mother as Bathanosh, preserving her oath to Lamech that the child is indeed his and not a watcher's offspring. What is remarkable about this text is not just the detail it provides, but the anxiety it assumes. The entire passage only makes sense in a world where the intermingling of human women with celestial beings was understood to be a real and recent phenomenon, close enough to living memory that a man could look at his own newborn son and genuinely wonder. That is the world into which the ark was built. That is the world from which Noah selected a wife, and from which his sons selected theirs. And the canonical Bible, which names not one of those women, is asking you to believe that their origins are irrelevant to the story of what survived. Several ancient traditions outside the canonical Bible attempted to fill this silence with names. The Book of Jubilees names the wife of Shem as Sedekatelabab, the wife of Ham as Neelatamaach, and the wife of Japheth as Adatanazes. These are not names that appear in Genesis. They are names preserved in a tradition that the councils of the 4th century decided not to include in the authoritative text. Why would someone preserve those names across centuries of oral and written transmission if they carried no significance? Names in the ancient Near Eastern world were not decorative. They were genealogical claims. They were statements of origin, of lineage, of who your people were and where you came from. To name a woman in an ancient text is to acknowledge that her line mattered. And if her line mattered, then the question of which line she came from becomes a question with consequences. Now think about this carefully. The pre-flood world, as Genesis describes it, was not neatly divided into two isolated populations that never interacted. The line of Cain built cities. Cities attract people. Cities generate commerce, exchange, the mingling of populations that, in smaller, more scattered settlements, would never encounter one another. The line of Seth is described as calling on the name of God, as maintaining a different orientation. But the text does not describe them as geographically or socially isolated from Cain's civilization. In a world where Cain's descendants were the ones building the infrastructure of antediluvian society, the metallurgists, the musicians, the architects, the pastoral economists, it is not a radical proposition to suggest that the line of Seth lived within or adjacent to that infrastructure. And when young men from Seth's line sought wives, they sought them in the world they inhabited, the world that Cain's descendants had built. Genesis 6, verse 2 states that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took them as wives. The Hebrew phrase translated as daughters of men is Beno ha-Adam, daughters of the human, of humanity broadly conceived, not daughters of a specific righteous line. The text is describing a general population of women, and the beings who chose from among them were choosing from the same general pool that Noah's sons would later have drawn from. The Book of Enoch is explicit that this mixing was not limited to celestial beings and human women. It spread through the human population as well, through the children of those unions, through the culture that normalized and celebrated what the Watchers had introduced. By the time Noah's sons were of marriageable age, the pre-flood world had been absorbing that influence for generations. The idea that 3 young men found wives who were completely untouched by the dominant civilization of their time is not a conclusion the text supports. It is a conclusion the text simply never addresses, and here is the detail that makes this more than speculation. After the flood, in Genesis 9, something happens between Noah and his son Ham that the text describes with deliberate vagueness. Ham sees his father's nakedness and tells his brothers. Noah wakes, learns what Ham has done, and curses Ham's son Canaan with a curse of servitude. Scholars have debated for centuries what seeing his father's nakedness actually means in the original Hebrew, because the phrase in other parts of the Old Testament carries specific connotations that go well beyond simple visual observation. Leviticus 18 uses nearly identical language to describe sexual violations. Whatever Ham did, it was serious enough to generate a multi-generational curse from a man who had just survived the destruction of the entire world. It was serious enough that the text reaches for the same language used to describe the most severe violations of ancient Hebrew law. And the most disturbing reading, supported by several ancient Jewish commentators, is that what Ham did was connected to something he had carried with him, some understanding, some practice, some orientation that had come through the women, through the culture, through the inheritance that the ark had transported without anyone fully accounting for what it contained. The women no one talks about carried something into the new world, and the new world was never quite as new as the story suggests. There is a man who appears in Genesis 10 like a sudden storm. He arrives without warning in the middle of a genealogical table, surrounded by names that receive a single line each. And yet the text stops to describe him with a density of language that signals to any careful reader that something different is happening here. His name is Nimrod. Genesis 10, verses 8 through 12 describe him as a mighty hunter before the Lord, as the beginning of whose kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar, and from there he went into Assyria and built Nineveh. In a passage that is otherwise a dry catalogue of nations and territories, Nimrod gets a portrait. He gets verbs, he gets momentum, and the civilization he builds bears a resemblance to the one that existed before the flood that is too precise to be coincidental. This is not a new beginning. This is a resumption. The Hebrew phrase used to describe Nimrod, Gibor Zayid Lifnei Adonai, is almost always translated as a mighty hunter before the Lord. But the word Gibor carries a weight that the English word mighty does not fully convey. It is the same root used to describe the Nephilim in Genesis 6, verse 4, where they are called the Gibborim of old, the mighty men of renown. It is a word associated with warriors of supernatural or exceptional capability, with figures who operate at the outer edge of human capacity. Nimrod is not simply described as a skilled outdoorsman. He is described using the same category of language reserved for the hybrid offspring of the Watchers. And the phrase before the Lord in the ancient Hebrew context does not necessarily mean in reverence to God. It can mean in defiance of God, in the face of God, as a challenge to divine authority. The ancient Targum of Jonathan, an Aramaic translation of the Hebrew scriptures with extensive interpretive expansions, translates the phrase explicitly as a man who was mighty in sin and rebellion before the Lord. That is a very different portrait. Nimrod descends from Ham through Cush, which places him in the line that carried whatever Ham brought out of the ark and into the post-flood world. Remember the curse of Canaan. Remember the deliberate vagueness of Genesis 9 and what it implies about what Ham had preserved and acted upon. Nimrod is Ham's grandson, and what he builds in Shinar is the first post-flood empire in the biblical record, a network of cities organized under centralized political authority, with Babel at its center. The name Babel in Hebrew is related to the word balal, meaning to confuse or to mix, but in the Akkadian language of Mesopotamia, it means gate of God or gate of the gods. The Tower of Babel in Genesis 11 is not described as a simple construction project. It is described as an attempt to build a structure whose top reaches into the heavens, and the explicit stated reason is so that the builders will not be scattered across the face of the earth. This is a theological project. This is a civilization asserting that it does not need to disperse, does not need to diversify, does not need to submit to the divine mandate given to Noah after the flood. It is a civilization that has decided to concentrate its power and reach upward. And here is where the connection to Cain's original civilization becomes impossible to ignore. Cain built a city in defiance of a divine sentence of wandering. Nimrod builds a city in defiance of a divine mandate to fill the earth. Cain's descendants produced the technological and cultural foundations of the antediluvian world. Nimrod's empire produces the architectural and political foundations of the post-flood world. Cain's line cultivated a theology of self-protection and escalating autonomy from divine authority, expressed most clearly in Lamech's speech. Nimrod's civilization builds a literal monument to human self-sufficiency, a tower that says, "We do not need to be scattered. We do not need to depend on heaven. We can reach it on our own terms." The structure of the rebellion is identical. The spirit animating it is the same. The only thing that changed is the generation. The ancient Jewish text known as the Pseudo-Philo, or the biblical antiquities of Philo, written in Hebrew before the destruction of the Second Temple, contains an extended account of the Tower of Babel, in which Nimrod is explicitly identified as the instigator and the theological architect of the project, the man who convinced the post-flood nations that building the tower was an act of self-preservation against another flood rather than an act of rebellion against God. That framing is crucial. Nimrod did not present his project as defiance. He presented it as security. He used the memory of catastrophe to justify a program of centralized human power that was, at its core, a refusal to trust God's covenant. The rainbow that God placed in the sky after the flood, the sign of divine promise never to flood the earth again, was not enough for Nimrod. He wanted a structure built by human hands as the guarantee of human survival. That is the theology of Cain. That is the civilization of Lamech. Wearing new clothes and speaking a new language, but operating from the same interior architecture. The ancient Mesopotamian texts that scholars have assembled from thousands of clay tablet fragments describe a figure in the early post-flood period whose characteristics overlap with Nimrod in ways that are difficult to attribute to coincidence. The Sumerian king Enmerkar, who ruled the city of Uruk in the earliest recorded period of Mesopotamian history, is described in the Sumerian epic known as Enmerkar and the Lord of Arada as a builder of the great temple complex of Uruk, as a king whose ambition extended to subjugating distant lands, and as a figure who presided over a time when all humanity spoke a single language before that unity was disrupted. The parallels with the Genesis account of Nimrod and Babel are structural and sequential. Different names, different cultural packaging, but the same story told from the inside of the civilization that Genesis describes from the outside. And if Enmerkar and Nimrod are pointing at the same historical moment, then what the Sumerian texts tell us about the knowledge and capability of the civilization fills in the gaps that Genesis leaves open. Stand in front of the Great Pyramid of Giza and try to comprehend what you are looking at. not the photographs, not the diagrams in textbooks. The actual structure. 2,300,000 individual stone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 metric tons, the heaviest exceeding 80 metric tons, assembled with a precision that modern engineers equipped with laser-guided instruments struggle to replicate. The base is level to within 2 centimeters across an area of over 5 hectares. The 4 sides are oriented to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of less than 0.04 of a degree. The structure encodes the ratio of pi and the golden ratio in its mathematical constants that Western civilization would not formally articulate for another 2,000 years after the pyramid was built. And the official explanation for how it was constructed involves copper chisels, wooden sledges, and an enormous labor force working without the wheel. That explanation has never satisfied the engineers who actually tried to model it, and it should not satisfy you. The problem with the pyramids is not just engineering, it is timing. The Great Pyramid was constructed approximately 4,500 years ago, which in the conventional chronology places it just a few centuries after the flood. A few centuries after 8 people stepped off an ark onto a depopulated earth, a civilization in the Nile Valley was producing the most precisely engineered structure in human history, a structure that modern construction technology could replicate only with enormous difficulty and at staggering cost. The conventional explanation is that Egyptian civilization developed with extraordinary speed, from simple beginnings to monumental architecture, in a very compressed time frame. But that explanation requires you to believe that the knowledge required to build the Great Pyramid was invented from scratch in that window. And the alternative explanation, the one that archaeology's institutional structures make very difficult to say out loud, is that the knowledge was not invented. It was inherited. Göbekli Tepe sits on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey and was discovered in its full extent only in the 1990s, when the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt recognized that what farmers had been plowing around for generations was not a Byzantine cemetery, but something far older and far more significant. The site has been dated by multiple independent methods to approximately 11,600 years before the present, which places it at the very boundary of what conventional archaeology considers the Neolithic period, the time when human beings were supposedly just beginning to transition from hunter-gatherer existence to settled agriculture. Göbekli Tepe predates that transition. It predates pottery. It predates writing. It predates the wheel. And it contains carved stone pillars up to 5.5 meters tall, weighing up to 10 metric tons each, decorated with high-relief animal carvings of extraordinary artistic quality, and arranged in precise circular enclosures that show clear evidence of astronomical alignment. This is not the work of people learning to organize. This is the work of people who already know how. And then, approximately 8,000 years ago, the entire site was deliberately buried. Every enclosure, every pillar, covered intentionally by human hands, as if someone wanted to preserve it, or hide it, or both. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe is one of the most anomalous facts in all of ancient archaeology, and it receives surprisingly little attention outside specialist literature. People do not bury things they consider worthless. They abandoned them. They cannibalized their materials. They let them decay. Deliberate burial is an act of preservation or concealment. And either motivation implies that the people doing the burying understood the value of what they were covering. They understood that it represented something that needed to be protected from whatever was coming. And what was coming, if you place Göbekli Tepe in the timeline that the biblical narrative suggests, was the flood. The dating of the burial aligns with the period that many scholars who work at the intersection of archaeology and ancient texts associate with the great catastrophe that reshaped the ancient Near Eastern world. Someone buried Göbekli Tepe because they knew the water was rising, and they wanted what was underneath to survive. The megalithic temples of Malta are older than Stonehenge and older than the Egyptian pyramids, with the oldest structures dated to approximately 5,800 years before the present. They are built from limestone blocks weighing up to 20 metric tons, fitted together without mortar, with a precision that leaves gaps of less than a few millimeters between stones that have been in place for nearly 6,000 years. The builders of these temples left no written record, no tool inventory, no construction manual. They appeared in the archaeological record, already knowing what they were doing, built their temples, and then vanished from the record with equal abruptness. The civilization that produced these structures has no known developmental sequence in Malta itself. There is no stratum of simpler earlier attempts. There is no learning curve visible in the stone. The Maltese temples appear, fully formed and technically accomplished, as if the people who built them had been building things like this somewhere else for a very long time before they arrived on the island. The ancient city of Pumapunku in what is now Bolivia contains stone blocks, some weighing over 100 metric tons, that have been cut and fitted with a precision that stonecutters working with modern diamond tip tools describe as humbling. The H-shaped blocks at the site are identical to one another with a consistency that implies either template-based manufacturing or machining, and they contain internal channels and interlocking joints that would require planning before cutting, meaning the builders understood the final assembly before they began shaping the individual components. The site sits at an altitude of nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, in a location the thin air makes sustained physical labor genuinely difficult, and where no trees large enough to serve as construction rollers grow within hundreds of kilometers. The conventional archaeological response to Pumapunku is to attribute it to the Tiwanaku culture and move on. But the Tiwanaku culture, by the conventional dating, postdates the flood by thousands of years, which means either the knowledge arrived with them from somewhere else, or the dating of the site is wrong. Neither answer is comfortable. Now, here is what all of these sites share, and why that shared characteristic matters for this story. Göbekli Tepe, the pyramids, the Maltese temples, Pumapunku, and dozens of other megalithic sites scattered across every inhabited continent all display the same signature. They appear without a visible developmental sequence. They demonstrate technical knowledge that exceeds what the surrounding culture is supposed to have possessed, and they are separate from one another by oceans and mountain ranges that conventional archaeology says should have prevented knowledge transfer. The standard explanation is parallel independent development. the idea that human minds, given similar problems, arrive at similar solutions. But parallel independent development does not explain identical mathematical ratios encoded in structures on opposite sides of the Earth. It does not explain the same astronomical alignments appearing in monuments built by cultures with no documented contact. It does not explain the same construction techniques appearing in stone that was quarried, shaped, and placed without any of the intermediate technological steps that the developmental model requires. The explanation that fits all of these facts is the one that institutional archaeology cannot accept without dismantling the framework it has spent 2 centuries constructing. The knowledge came from somewhere. It was distributed. It was preserved through catastrophe. And the people who carried it were not primitive survivors rebuilding from nothing. They were the heirs of a civilization that the flood was supposed to have erased, arriving in new lands, speaking new languages, carrying in their hands and in their memories the technical inheritance of a world that was never supposed to be remembered. Beneath the Apostolic Palace in Vatican City, accessible only through a series of controlled corridors, and requiring written authorization from the Vatican Secretariat of State, lies one of the largest private archives in human history. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, known until the year 2019 as the Vatican Secret Archive, contains approximately 85 linear kilometers of shelving, housing documents that span 12 centuries of institutional history, papal correspondence, council records, Inquisition transcripts, and collections of manuscripts acquired through centuries of church expansion across every inhabited continent. The word secret, in its original Latin designation, secretum, means private or personal rather than hidden, and Vatican officials are careful to make this distinction whenever the archive attracts public attention. But the distinction between private and hidden becomes philosophically thin when the materials in question are ancient texts that predate the church itself, that were gathered from traditions the church spent centuries attempting to suppress, and that have never been made available for independent scholarly examination in their complete form. The archive is not a conspiracy. It is something more mundane and more troubling than a conspiracy. It is an institution that has had the longest continuous custody of ancient documents in Western history, with the strongest institutional motivation in Western history to control what those documents say about the origins of humanity. The process by which certain texts were excluded from the biblical canon in the 4th century was not a single event. It was a series of councils, debates, and administrative decisions spread across decades, shaped by theological priorities, political pressures, and the very human need to produce a coherent and manageable document from an enormous diversity of source material. The Council of Laodicea around the year 363, the Council of Hippo in 393, and the Council of Carthage in 397 progressively narrowed the list of texts considered authoritative. What is less commonly discussed is what happened to the texts that were excluded. Some were simply declared non-authoritative and allowed to circulate in diminished status. Others were actively condemned. And others, the ones that touch most directly on the pre-flood, the Watchers, the mechanics of the Nephilim, and the survival of forbidden knowledge, the survival of forbidden, entered the custody of institutions that had both the resources to preserve them and the motivation to restrict their distribution. The Book of Enoch is the most prominent example, but it is not the only one. The Book of Giants, known from fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, appears to have been a widespread and well-regarded text in the centuries immediately before and after the time of Jesus, circulating in Jewish and early Christian communities across the ancient Near East. It describes the Nephilim in detail, names them individually, describes their physical characteristics and their violence, and most significantly describes their dreams and visions before the flood, in which they receive foreknowledge of the judgment coming against them. The Book of Giants was found in multiple copies at Qumran, suggesting it was considered important enough to preserve in quantity, and versions of it appear to have circulated as far as Central Asia, where Manichaean communities incorporated adapted versions into their own cosmological literature. And yet the Book of Giants does not appear in any standard biblical canon. It does not appear in the Catholic Apocrypha. It does not appear in the deuterocanonical texts that the Catholic Church accepts. It exists in fragments, in translations of translates, in the hands of specialists, effectively inaccessible to the ordinary reader who has never been told it exists. The Dead Sea Scrolls themselves represent one of the most significant discoveries in the history of biblical scholarship, and their story contains details that deserve more scrutiny than they typically receive. The scrolls were discovered beginning in the year 1947 in caves near Qumran on the western shore of the Dead Sea, and the full scholarly community did not gain access to the complete photographic archive of the scrolls until 1991, more than 40 years after their discovery. For 4 decades, access to the most important cache of ancient Jewish manuscripts ever found was controlled by a small international team whose members were appointed by institutions with significant theological interest in the content of those manuscripts. Some scholars who sought access during that period and were denied it used language about the experience that bordered on exasperated fury. When the full archive was finally released, it contained texts that had not been publicly known, among them additional fragments of the Book of Enoch, portions of the Book of Giants, and other cosmological texts describing the world in terms that the canonical Bible had carefully avoided. The delay in access was explained as a matter of scholarly procedure and resource limitation. But 44 years is not a backlog. It is a policy. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained the most complete version of the Book of Enoch in continuous liturgical use for over 1,500 years, treating it as canonical scripture alongside Genesis and the Psalms. The Ethiopian canon includes books that no other Christian tradition accepts, among them the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Enoch, and additional texts that provide extensive detail about the pre-flood world. When Western scholars encountered the Ethiopian canon in the 18th and 19th centuries, the institutional response was not to reconsider the Western canon in light of this older tradition. It was to classify the Ethiopian editions as pseudepigraphal, meaning falsely attributed, and to treat the Ethiopian Church's centuries of unbroken textual custody as a curiosity rather than as evidence. The academic vocabulary of dismissal, pseudepigraphal, apocryphal, non-canonical, functions in practice as a way of placing certain texts outside the boundary of serious theological consideration without engaging their content directly. And the content of the texts classified this way is, with remarkable consistency, content that describes the pre-flood world and its surviving legacy in terms that the canonical narrative cannot easily accommodate. There is a specific category of Vatican-held manuscript that scholars who specialize in ancient Near Eastern languages have been requesting access to for decades without success. These are Aramaic and early Hebrew texts acquired by the Church during its expansion into the communities of the ancient Near East, texts that were gathered from Jewish and early Christian communities in Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia between the 3rd and 7th centuries of the Common Era. Some of these texts are catalogued in the Vatican Archive's own finding aids, meaning their existence is not denied. Their titles are listed, their approximate dates and provenance are noted, and access to them for independent examination has been declined repeatedly on grounds of preservation concerns and ongoing internal study. The pattern is not that these texts are secret. The pattern is that their content remains unverified by anyone outside the institution that holds them. And in the absence of verification, what they say about the lineage of Cain and the survival of the pre-flood world remains exactly where the institution holding them needs it to remain, in the realm of the unconfirmed.